The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today to discuss Asembia 2023 and beyond. Today we have Dave Weiss, Bill Roth, and Michael Kerman joining us. But before I turn it over to Michael, a few housekeeping items. We will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation, but encourage you to ask your questions throughout. The question panel can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be recording the session, but we will only be sending out the recording as requested. If you would like the recording, please reach out to Dave Weiss or Bill Roth following the presentation. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Michael to get us started.
Thanks, Jen. Good day, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Michael Kerman. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing for IntegraChain. And about 2 weeks ago, we all came back from the Asembia conference, one of the premier conference for us and the rest of the industry. And we had sent almost 30 people there. And one thing that became clear is a lot of people were busy with customer meetings, and not everybody got to a lot of the sessions. So we decided to collect and aggregate, as we do, all of the feedback, and we really came up with a lot of interesting topics, and we thought we'd kind of share those with you, and hopefully we'll have some good questions at the end. So joining me today, as Jen mentioned, is Dave Weiss, who is our Vice President of Industry Solutions, and Dave's been to more than his share of Asembia conferences. And also Bill Roth. Bill Roth is known throughout the industry, Senior Vice President, General Manager of Consulting, founder of Bluefin Consulting. And I think they together have just a tremendous depth and breadth of knowledge of not only channel, but also all of the dependencies and implications that that are happening in our industry. And I think they'll comment that we're seeing an unprecedented level of change and transformation and uncertainty. And I think that will be woven throughout their comments. So we'll be talking about a number of topics. Start with just sort of their takeaways from the conference, talk about digitalization. Certainly can't pass on the Inflation Reduction Act, talk about the LOE wave, and then wrap up with maybe some things that we didn't hear and some questions. So without further ado, I'll kind of move on to the first topic of and I'll start with you, Bill. But what were your top one or two takeaways from this year, especially as it relates to kind of the pharmacy dispensing landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So kind of one observation and kind of two key takeaways. One, I thought that Doug Long's presentation as part of the general address was pretty telling for the complexity that is inherent in our model these days. Because I have to remind myself that even 15 years ago, if you were launching a primary care product, it was kind of a one-size-fits-all model, and it's continued to get more and more diversified. And I feel within that diversification is kind of the first key takeaway is I think the access and channel issues that we all saw out of the gate with traditional specialty pharmacy, so oncology, immunology, neurology, so on and so forth, those access issues have trickled down not just to specialty light, which I know we're going to talk a lot about that this afternoon, but also to basic brands that apply to retail. Like the abandonment rates that we are seeing in specialty pharmacy have now been applied to retail for your typical branded products. We are seeing prior authorizations, we're seeing step edits, and within that, I mean, I know we're going to probably talk about digitization, but we can't afford the human labor that it costs to bring a patient onto therapy anymore, which I think is kind of my second big takeaway is specialty pharmacy really can't afford to buy product through an intermediary, because even a 50 basis point or 100 basis point differential that's kind of trapped in the distribution layer. That's why specialty pharmacies buy half of their dollars directly. Like the margin's been pushed so far down that the pharmacies don't make money. And the last comment I'll make is I think we have a problem on our hands. I think pharmacies have asked manufacturers for money for so many years that we're kind of numb to it. And now we really do have a problem on our hands. So it's a bit of a Chicken Little situation we have. The sky is actually falling now. And like, will manufacturers hear the needs? Because pharmacies walked away from a lot of drugs in 22 and they continue to walk away in 23. Dave?
Yeah, Bill, thanks. So Michael, first off, thanks for being so generous with one or two takeaways because this conference was really massive and was, there was so many issues and so much complexity. So, just doing one or two is tough. But I agree wholeheartedly with everything Bill was discussing. My first takeaway just was, just how, despite a lot of headwinds in the marketplace, and I'll kind of get into those in point two, there's incredible innovation going on in specialty pharmacy right now. And I'll, we could talk about it on the pharma side itself with cell and gene, orphan rare. During the conference, there was an announcement of, breakthroughs in, the neurology. So we can, I think there's that's a sort of whole area that onto itself with many unique requirements. So, just on the pharma side, there's incredible innovation. But then, when you look at all the vendors that attend Asembia itself and all of the other sort of, innovators that are there from a channel perspective and from a patient services perspective, I was just sort of, blown away how this sort of the service layer underneath that continues to innovate dramatically, and digitalization is a big word, and that's really exciting because there's so much manual intervention, so much sort of human engagement that adds cost to the process, and you're not going to completely get rid of all of that, but in order to sort of conquer some of the economic issues in the channel that are affecting everybody, you're going to need to sort of, do something disruptive. And I thought it was really interesting that, Mark Cuban was walking around. I saw him on day one a couple of times, not making a big sort of spectacle of himself, but attending that conference. And I thought that was really telling, like, and there was sort of a ripple through the audience, like, what is Mark Cuban doing here? Is he just, trying to bring the sort of the cash thing into specialty? Is he trying to recruit more brands? Is he thinking about buying a specialty pharmacy? All these sort of thoughts run through your head, but, it did bring to my thought that the area is there's innovation and potentially room for some kind of disruption. Point two, we do serve manufacturers mostly, particularly in my practice. We do serve that. So, and we do sort of work a lot on the sort of the channel side as well as the net revenue side. Obviously, with things like IRA and other issues, it's going to be pretty choppy waters ahead. Everybody knows that. And, there's a lot of the obvious things that we're going to have to grapple with coming out of the IRA that are going to be, difficult. My sort of background is in economics, and I always worry about the unintended consequences of sort of regulatory regimes. And it sort of feels like, we're in whack-a-mole mode, and particularly that regulatory sort of regime is very kind of anti-pharma itself. And, it's sort of whack-a-mole, like, we did OBRA, all the, then we had to fix all the problems with OBRA, boom. Then we had the Medicare Modernization Act, we had to fix all of that, boom, and on and on and on. And we're playing whack-a-mole with this and not really addressing the underlying problems that are driving cost. Because the net revenue landscape for manufacturers is tough. And to Bill's point, like, pharmacies are struggling, but how much can pharma afford going forward to sort of fund, more services, more patient assistance, contracts and incentives for pharmacies? It's going to be choppy. So kind of Class A rapids ahead. And then, my last point is not really a point, it's actually an acknowledgement. I got to spend a little more time with the folks from Asembia, and I just have to personally, I'm just sort of blown away by how big and massive and how much better this event gets every year. So I wanted to just send out, like, my thoughts and appreciation to the Asembia crew, because I thought they did a phenomenal job. And the other thing that I attended the main session. I was a little bit, I was actually quite touched when Larry Irene sort of paid tribute to his mom leading into Mother's Day. That kind of got to me. So, I appreciated that. We all stand on somebody else's shoulders. So in a moment of, probably triumph, to sort of remember that as it was really touched me. So those would be my initial sort of thoughts. And I think we'll probably unpack some of that a little bit further on.
Okay, great. Okay, so we talked a little bit about specialty pharmacies, and Bill brought up the specialty light. Let's kind of drill into that a little bit more. Can you elaborate on the union of those two aspects of business? Dave, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So actually, Bill, were you going to kind of go into your categories of pharmacies first?
Well, actually, okay. Off on specialty light, so really that's the hot button, and then maybe I can contextualize afterwards.
Gotcha. All right. So yeah, I mean, so talking about specialty light's an area sort of I worked a lot in, and Bruce Phelan from the Bluefin team did a really phenomenal presentation on it. So for anybody that was unable to attend and can get their hands on that presentation, highly recommend it. But specialty light is it's really clear that there's this sort of there are products that don't really fit, and sort of traditional brands that are launching that don't really fit into the retail pharmacy segment. Most of the chains right now, pharmacies are underwater, they're under pressure, they're not making any money from brand products, and yet there is sort of a whole class of innovative products that might not be, massive, diabetes brands, et cetera, that where there's a patient population for it, but it's not quite as large. And these drugs that might be sort of underneath the sort of price point or the cost of some of the larger specialty meds. And so specialty pharmacies, the traditional specialty pharmacies, can't really make any money on them, yet pharmacies can't really stock them. So there's this sort of like, sort of inflection point in the marketplace where a lot of, unique providers have stepped in to fill some of those roles, because there still is plenty of payer controls that are on that. And so you need to have some of the hub-like services. You need to have some of the sort of PA and benefit investigation and PA types of services, but yet you kind of right size that for this audience. So, this is the part of the marketplace that's been, really kind of interesting and exciting to sort of observe. And there's so many different providers forming in this place, and including, I would say, Asembia with their Aspen network, but many others, Blink Health, NowRx, there's just, PhilRx. There are so many of these companies sort of filling in that space, and they're really doing it with technology and making it as easy as possible on the provider and the patient. Really, ends up being the provider who wastes a lot of time on these drugs. In fact, I'm going through that personally myself, and it's a nightmare for the provider, like going through trying to get something approved, and then for me to go get this prescription filled. So the digitization that's occurring with some of these innovative companies is really interesting. It's filling in a really big and necessary sort of void in the marketplace. I think some of that digitization is going to also swim upstream and blur the lines into, some of these entities may eventually become, some of that technology is going to start to filter into this, the traditional specialty pharmacy world as well. It has to. And so the lines are blurred. I mean, specialty light isn't a real, in a sense, it's not a real thing. They're specialty products. They just have a slightly different, sort of price point. They may be a little less complex than some of the other, like certainly cell and gene and orphan rare drugs, but they have they definitely need some patient services, and traditional pharmacists don't have the time to deal with those patients and those brands. So, and I was sort of like, and continue to be really, really impressed by how many service providers are out there filling it in and then integrating into things like Cover My Meds, and really making the whole process completely digital along the way. And I sort of see that as a really hopeful sign, and hopefully that starts to get adopted through all of the different pharmacy models that are out there.
Yes, so I think if I pick up from there, so maybe we take a step back and let's define how we view specialty light. Because I agree with Dave. I mean, it's a somewhat ambiguous topic, but I think the way we traditionally looked at it is, years ago, if you were over $20,000 a year in annual cost of your product at WAC, you were a specialty product, right? I mean, you're too expensive and too complex for a retailer to work with, so it goes to specialty. And a lot of primary care products, I mean, the government kind of sets the definition of specialty of roughly anything around over 8,000. So initially, it was a band between $8,000 and $20,000 a year in therapy. So maybe not the full opinion of Integra Chain and Bluefin, but Bill Roth's view is, I'm seeing it nowadays between $5,000 a year and $25,000 a year. So the PCSK9 inhibitors are kind of still the poster child of what we're talking about here. And what happened was, the pharmacies just refused to bring them in. They refused to dispense, not stock, they refused to dispense. So it wasn't expensive enough for specialty pharmacy to cover the cost, like the reimbursement value wasn't enough to cover the cost of, the cost to serve the product. And then it's way too expensive for a retailer. Like 92% of what goes to a retailer is generic, right? And it runs through at a 3% error rate, and they're making 43 cents on the dollar, versus a brand, it's 8% of the prescriptions, but a retailer is only making 3 cents on the dollar. So if anything represents a hiccup, or if it looks like work, the retailer's like, no, we just can't make money on it. And we actually have screenshots now from the retailers out there that literally say, do not accept prescriptions for this product. And they give all the alternatives, and there's lots of obviously generics out there. And so, it was interesting because we kind of stood back on it. I was actually telling Mike and Dave even before we joined the meeting this afternoon, it kind of forced us to define how many types of pharmacy are out there. I think Doug Long put a pretty interesting view out there, which is there's retail, classic brick and mortar, there's mail, which we've all known for a long time, and then it's kind of like non-retail. So they kind of look at it in three big buckets. But we took it apart to say, there really is 9 forms of pharmacy. And the reason we do it is because they all operate differently. They all have a different mix. They all have a different model. And so you've got retail, and then you've got specialty independent, which still functions very differently than the third, which is specialty payer. Because the specialty payer markets, they kind of, like, they've got higher abandonment rates. They kind of look at it like, well, they have a captive market because they kind of own the life to some degrees. At least that can be their perception. Number four is, I think, what Dave was referring to, is we're watching a new form of pharmacy emerge in front of our eyes. Call it e-commerce, call it digital, call it integrated pharmacy and hub model. But these are like the Amazons, the Curants, the CarePaths, the Blinks, the Phils. I mean, there's a long list of them out there. And we can come back on those, I think, later. But we'd also call out the cash pharmacy that's come online, right? I mean, and it's not just the Romans and Hims and Hers and like all those kind of unique things that focus on a particular area. It's also things like cost plus pharmacy. And so it's very curious that a billionaire like Mark Cuban is walking the halls of Asembia trying to think, how big is this cash market going to be? And it's not limited just to generics, which I think is the obvious, but have a meeting with GoodRx. I mean, Keel Williams, who runs their manufacturer relationships, he's got a clean view of what is actually happening out there with the market. So that's number five. Number six is hospital specialty pharmacy. Not really well talked about at Asembia, but it is a third of all the oncology prescriptions that are out there, followed by in-office dispensing, which is also a third of the oncology products that are out there. So it's very different from the pie chart that some of the pundits will show you, that it all belongs to CVS and Optum, and that's not true for oncology. It's far from it. The payer SPs barely have any presence in oncology, which is the number one therapeutic area within specialty. And like, you actually had the guys from Encoda at Asembia this year. Mike Reff, who's their president, was out there. So he's the head of the in-office dispenser group over oncology. So I mean, they're out there, but I doubt they were obvious to a lot of manufacturers. And then the eighth would be outsourced pharmacy, which is growing. I think a lot of people know CPS and Trellis and Shields, but there's House RX now on the in-office dispenser side, and the guys behind House are the ones that did Flatiron. And these guys really know. One Oncology just sold last week or week before for 2.1 billion, mixed between private equity and AmerisourceBergen. And then the ninth is also not an obvious area, which is manufacturer direct. I mean, UPS actually has a full offering that if a manufacturer wants to set up a direct to patient, it's one phone call. And so you do actually see these things merging out there. So that's a lot. And I mean, I'll speak for myself. I wasn't thinking about it that way, but that was a big takeaway for me at Asembia. It's like, we got to be really careful about our generalizations these days.
Great. So, Bill, you talked a little bit about, buying direct. Can you elaborate on kind of why this is such a big topic?
Yeah, and I think, for the record, I'm never going to use the word alternative distribution again, because alternative implies that there's a primary form, and I don't think there is a primary form of distribution, because I'll quote off all the archetypes that are direct. Cell and gene goes direct. Orphan rare goes direct. 50% of vaccines goes direct. 50% of specialty pharmacy products goes direct. Actually, Dave, you were the one that taught me this. 35% of specialty light goes direct. So that is the primary mode for those archetypes. Indirect would be the alternate, if you had that point of view. So I think we're kind of caught in the past a little bit. And what I think is happening, though, that the reason we're talking more and more about direct is, I do think, and this is a recent observation, I think the wholesalers have pushed too far on generics, biosimilars, and emerging pharma. I mean, I won't get into the rates we're seeing in the market. I think a lot of you guys already know what those are, but they're being pushed to the point where they're going out of business. Acorn, Lynette filed for Chapter 11. We see companies like Synexus go out. From what I can see, 4 of the 8 adalimumabs for Humira won't make it to market. They're being asked for too much money. So the PBM wants 50%, the pharmacy wants 10, the distributor wants 10. What's left? And you've already discounted it probably 20% or more from the reference product. So I guess we are seeing, and it's specific to wholesale distribution, not specialty, not physician, but wholesale's pushed so far. And we were really curious as to why. And I was working with a client last week, and I'm like, oh, I think I figured out the why. So going back to 2016, the generic patent cliff ended, and that means that no more material generics come to market. Like after Lipitor and Nexium went out, there wasn't more coming. And I think the retail models and the distribution models, they relied on a mix of generic and brand. Now the generic has stayed stationary, and brand, just with price increases over the last 5 years, you can see like 5 to 9% lift. So brand is getting bigger and bigger, and what products are coming to market? Reference products, brands. So the mix is getting blown out. So the wholesaler hasn't had the money that they typically have on generics to be able to afford the cost less. So now they're pushing all these other models to go into that area, and they're pushing to a point where they're breaking the value proposition. I don't think our manufacturers view wholesalers as a neutral intermediary at the moment. And I do think there's a lot of questions around kind of what direct distribution looks like. But given the prevalence of direct already in so many archetypes that are out there, there's a great opportunity to disrupt. I mean, we had a client, and I'll kind of end here, but we had a client with a WAC in the thousands of dollars, and they were paying a pretty large percentage, and the vast majority of their sales were 340B at a price that was about a quarter of what their WAC was. And when you looked at the dollars that they were paying for distribution, it was almost half the value of the contract cost. And so there are 3PLs out there that have picked up on this, like DCS, Direct Customer Solutions. They're out there actively in the market showing manufacturers how this works. So I think we're on the edge of something big here.
Dave, I think you have some data you want to share.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of data. So Bill, I did update some. I think the reference you were talking about was from some data I pulled last year, and I, kind of looked at about 8 of these kind of specialty light brands that have launched, over the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years, and looked at the last 8 quarters, and they're sort of blinded, and sort of you could see sort of like how much their average annual sales were, and then what percentage of their sales are direct. And you could see it is a bit all over the place, but on a dollar basis, what you'll see is it's now up to over 53% for these particular brands. Now, let me say, these brands were primarily first brands launched by effectively either small manufacturers or emerging manufacturers. To your point about the economics of the indirect channel, they really had no choice but to explore other options. But it is a bit all over the place. Some have launched entirely with direct, some a little less so, and it sort of really does depend. But on average, it's about 53%. If we look at it on a unit basis, it's even a little bit higher. So still early days in this. There's still, what is especially light is, again, it's a bit of an evolving scenario, but and we do see, this sort of kicking up from even when I did this last, last year, it was the prior 2 years from that. So it's definitely seems to be moving in this direction. Now, on I did want to also offer up just one other point about why even big pharma manufacturers are beginning to seriously question this. And Bill, you did a great job of sort of laying out the feeling that the observation that wholesalers, particularly full line wholesalers, are really not on the brand company's sides in this. What we're kind of seeing is a lot of even our big manufacturing customers are, they're not abandoning full line wholesale, and the economics of it for them are still good. But where we see a product that maybe it doesn't have has a lumpier demand pattern, isn't like, it's sort of, not always, it is lumpy in terms of demand, or or it's a class that has a lot of generic competition, and those, they're effectively being counter detailed at the pharmacy by generics and generic dispensing ratios. There's a feeling that your business partner is kind of working against you. So one of the other things that I'm hearing is a lot more interest in, let's call it, best practices and benchmarking around not DSAs from a fee perspective, but DSAs from a metric perspective, and how do we drive better visibility and accountability, and at the same time better communication with the trade partners over what a manufacturer expects and wants, and does it in a way that their trade partners can fulfill the terms of those agreements. Because, as you know, manufacturers, FMVs, are very much under pressure, and everybody's going to be looking to save some money. So we definitely see larger manufacturers starting to think about it. They haven't made the turn yet, but they're definitely thinking about it, and they're also thinking about a lot more accountability in the next generation of DSAs coming up. Great. So, Michael?
Sure. So what about from let's kind of shift gears here a little bit about from a patient service provider perspective.
Do you want me to go, Dave?
Bill, why don't you kick it off?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think probably David and I will throw the baton back and forth on this one, because we're both fascinated by the digitization of all the patient journey. And I do think that's the intersection of what's treating specialty light. So, like, what's the line? Necessity is the mother of invention, or something to that effect. I mean, at the price point, a specialty light needs a hub, but there's not enough money to afford a hub. So basically, specialty pharmacy has become the hub. And I mean, Asembia's solution is pretty slick, right? I mean, they've got 60 products up and running underneath them, and they've integrated technology that, like, as you're walking out the doctor's door, you get a phone call, and they're helping you access your drug with a digital hub online. And then I think they support you too. They've got 300 products now running up underneath BioBridge, and that product is there at the pharmacy in 24 hours. So they've created a solution that's pretty slick for this, and it all resides within the digitization. So maybe Dave and I can kind of go back and forth on that. But before we go deeper on the digitization, and I think within this, though, what's haunting me is the need for this on a macro basis. So again, this is kind of fresh knowledge in the last couple of weeks, but when I was talking to our CEO, Josh Halpern, we've all been focused on the $250 billion gross to net bubble, right? I mean, we talk about it ad nauseum, and we know it's going to pop one day, and it may pop slowly, may pop quickly. We can argue that all day long. There's another bubble, though, that we haven't really talked about as a bubble, and that's the specialty LOE wave. And Josh and I look at each other like, wait, how much overlap is there between the $250 billion gross to net bubble and the $225 billion specialty LOE bubble. Like, probably not that much. I mean, with the exception of maybe immunology and neurology, but oncology really doesn't discount the way, and a lot of specialty products, definitely orphan rare, that stuff's not discounted the way that primary care brands are. So we think the bubble is a little larger. It may be in the $400 billion mark of a $650 billion industry. And what's that going to mean? It means we're in this huge game of musical chairs, and somebody's chair is getting pulled. So when you see Kaiser by Geisinger, when you see Premier's announcement on Monday that they're up for sale now, I mean, those are punts. Envision Healthcare filed for bankruptcy. All these manufacturers are filing for bankruptcy. So you can feel the pressure coming down. Bottom line is we can't afford humans. So kind of back to the digitization, that's the only way that it's going to become cost effective. I mean, I don't think it's enough, but I think we have to look long and hard, because I think we were on the fence as an industry for a long time. Should we go to digital? I don't know. I make more money when it's human labor. I mean, every patient services hub out there asks the same question, but specialty pharmacy was driven to it from their business model. And I think that's what's fundamentally different is they're having to do it from a survival mechanism. They have to bring in the AI. They have to bring in the tech. And what labor they do have, they're starting to outsource now to other countries that have dramatically cheaper labor, that when a human is needed to intervene, they're bringing in resources from outside of the US at a much more cost-effective approach. So Dave, I know this is a hot button for you. I don't want to steal all the mic time here.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think that, you know, we talked about the digitization theme, but I agree that, you know, especially light as a category needs to sort of gain scale. And, you know, the digitalization, however you want to say it, is one mechanism to do that. In terms of surprises around this, I mean, I guess maybe one of the surprises that I have around the mass scale is, you know, there is this, and I didn't hear a lot of talk about it at Asembia, probably because they're maybe not welcome, is sort of the whole specialty and retail sort of dialogue, which it surprised me that we're starting to see more chains, both, you know, sort of the national chains and some of the food store chains, the Krogers, et cetera, that are trying to develop a specialty model, you know, started to warehouse product more as well. So, you know, part of me wonders does that sort of whole specialty and retail thing, which was kind of a hot topic a couple of years ago, you know, with Kroger's acquisitions and trying to grow that, is that maybe one other avenue to kind of get this sort of specialty and retail thing scaled back up in a way. And so that was just one of the, I guess it's an open question in my mind, but we are starting to see some of the chains starting to warehouse some of these specialty products now and trying to elbow their way into the specialty pharmacy market more and more, because it is a marketplace that does require, to some extent, more scale if it's going to become a predominant or much larger channel of distribution going forward.
Okay. All right, Dave and Bill, I'm going to challenge you now. So we're going to switch gears, and with some trepidation, I'm going to ask this next question, which is, we need to discuss the IRA in 5 to 7 minutes.
All right, so I'm going to jump in on this one quickly then. So I'm tired of talking about the IRA. I want to talk about the implications of the IRA, because I don't think people are courageous enough yet to make this call. And I will say I'm very concerned with what I see. So I do have some thoughts on this. One is when you combine the removal of the Medicaid rebate cap, which I'm not sure how familiar everybody on the line is with that, but you probably heard the word penny pricing. What that means is we capitated how much you can go down So when you're penny priced, you're basically making no money at all on your product, and that's before you apply SGA and COGS. So now you've removed that cap. So now you'll literally be paying Medicaid for people to use the drug if you don't do your price increases the right way. And you'd be shocked to know how many manufacturers do not understand this. I'm very disappointed in the industry. On top of that lies the IRA, which now you've capped price. You've applied the same URI penalty for Medicaid, now for Medicare, both in Part D in 22 and now in Part B in 23. Collectively, that makes up 55% of the units in our industry. The government has, I don't think our manufacturing industry wants to acknowledge this as pointedly as I'm going to say right now, but they've effectively removed the incentives to increase price of a product. The ripple effects on every single model that depends upon price increases, from manufacturers to PBMs to pharmacies to distributors to GPOs back to Premier, is a big deal. Number two, whatever politician thought adding a price cap at $2,000 out of pocket for Medicare was a good idea, you just took away the incentive to switch anybody to a biosimilar or to a specialty generic. Did you mean to do that, government? Again, I know it's hard because there's a lot of connected pieces, but we got 225 billion set to go off patent, and the government just took away the incentive to switch a Medicare life from a reference product to a biosimilar. I don't think they meant to do that, but that is what they did indeed do. The 340B cliff that folks love to talk about, the acceleration that's picked up on that in the last 5 years has left WAC in the dust. And manufacturers are stepping back and looking at, well, why am I paying all my fees off of WAC if my real landed cost in the market is a quarter of my WAC? So WAC decreases are very much real. It's the number one fear point of the PBM, number one fear point of the distributor. But if we reduce WAC, wait for this one, we also reduce AWP, right? Because they're tied. That means that we will reduce WACs in retail, which opens up the cash market. That's why Mark Cuban was walking the hallways. I mean, that's like, oh, wow. And then lastly, and I hate to say this, we are seeing manufacturers walk from Medicaid and 340B. I feel sorry for the people that's going to affect, but when the government puts this much draconian pressure on top of the system, it may not make sense to stay in the Medicaid, which is tied to the 340B market. I mean, we can talk about supply chain interruptions and discontinuations. We're seeing this pop up as a headline now in New York Times, and it's all over PCMA. So that's just what we've been able to see so far. So news at 11 on this one.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said, Bill. And you know, I'm stunned about the IRA in other ways from a just sort of unintended consequences perspective, because you know, if you take away any ability to ever raise price, and it does bring up the constitutionality of it and the legality of it. And I know the industry is going to try to push back, but that's going to be a difficult slog. If you can't raise price and everything is about trying to curtail the prices that manufacturers charge, and some of the biggest products that you're going to negotiate with a gun to your head on, and assuming that what the government will pay will go down on those, anything that falls outside of that, what are you left with? You're going to have to basically increase the prices on those drugs or stop making them.
Well, Dave, I apologize for interrupting you, but you did see how many companies are leaving bio, and the third company left Pharma this week. So who's going to be lobbying those petitions?
Right. And, you know, I mean, so I wonder to what extent manufacturers are going to trim their portfolios or exit, you know, certain programs entirely, or just stop making certain drugs. And I don't know if anybody caught the last 2 days, the New York Times, which is not exactly, you know, rah-rah for pharma at all ever, basically did two pieces on drug shortages One related to hospital drug shortages, and particularly like injectable generics, or especially generics, hospitals unable to find, basic products that have been around for years and years and years, because nobody wants to make them. And you'd referenced Acorn, just like literally shutting its doors overnight, leaving everybody hanging. We can expect to see more of that. What's the incentive for anybody to make those drugs? And it's great. We appreciate the sort of the folks like Civic RX and and other sort of groups that are public interest groups that are trying to fill that void, but it's not going to be able to do it at the scale where all these needs are. The other article in the New York Times was about pharmacists not wanting to prescribe drugs because of like perceived scrutiny over how much they're prescribing. That's a hangover of the opioid epidemic. And so not even wanting to prescribe Adderall or ADHD meds. And so you look at this, we're on the cusp of major changes coming in neurology, and a lot of those drugs have REMS, have maybe controlled substances, and you have pharmacies that don't want to touch them. Mail order won't touch them. So what happens to all of those, the major depressive disorders? I mean, you're going to see sort of the community health. This may be another direction it goes, is all of that kind of goes more to community health type pharmacies and so forth. So I just wonder, it's hard to envision drug shortages, but the unintended consequences of these things played out over a number of years. Suddenly, are we looking out there and wondering, what happened to a certain antibiotic that we used to be able to have access to, and how much will big manufacturers want to continue to make those at a loss? So we'll have to see.
I mean, one thing just to add on to that, Dave, is like, and I put myself in this camp, I think we take a lot of things for granted in our industry. And like retail pharmacy's always been there. And like you and I made the comment last time I was with you live, you can't go into the pharmacy you've always gone into and get your product anymore. Like they don't even know where to get it anymore. So just things that have always been constant are no longer constant. And I think that's the hard part, is like, how do you see this as a manufacturer? Because you see your one product or I mean, like your one portfolio, and you have all these other things that are happening around you that have an indirect impact on you. It's concerning.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's bad policy played out. And you mentioned 340B. I mean, I just happened to be looking at the 340B, the HRSA website the other day, to look at the results of audits, and they're averaging of the audits that HRSA itself does, and on its own covered entities, 20% of those audits end up with a repayment to manufacturers, and about 10% of the audits end up with either throwing a covered entity or covered entity site or contract pharmacy out of the program entirely.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's doing anything about that, or the waste, fraud, and abuse in there. And those are discounts that are often not being passed along to the patients.
Well, yeah,
it's just one-sided.
And like you pop that whack bubble, and the discounts that the wholesalers are offering to cost less 10 to the hospitals, like that doesn't, it's not there when that whack bubble pops. Like, does the hospital know that? Are they ready for that? So if 340B pops and the discount on top of 340B pops, what's that implication look like? I mean, we can have a whole conversation, I think, Michael, on this one. So you may want to move this on, otherwise we're going to get stuck in the middle.
We'll be here forever. Yeah.
Yeah. Just a reminder, we got about 10 minutes left. Obviously, if you have any questions, use the question box, in the application, and we'll move on to the last two questions. So Bill, you mentioned about you mentioned the LOE wave. I wonder if you could just briefly just elaborate a little further on that in terms of how it's going to drive different payer and channel behaviors?
So I can go with some brevity on this if you want me to. So I don't think biosimilars and specialty generics are going to be as successful as I think the market hopes. I think they're going to be effective popping the $225 billion bubble. But the difference in specialty generics and biosimilars is they are indeed treated like brands. I know there's lots of channels out there that want to have them act like generics, but they don't. They emulate brands. You have to have a name, you have to have a field sales force in many cases, you have to get it on formulary, that takes a rebate, that takes a market access team, it takes a smart trade policy. It doesn't resemble anything like retail generics where you make a deal with one of the purchasing alliances and the rest just kind of happens on its own. So, but the reference products are staying in tier 4 with the specialty generic. Now, I mean, it could change. The PBMs could wake up one day and create another classification and break out biosimilars and specialty generics. But like you look at immunology alone, and the PBMs make roughly 25% of the rebates, I think, on the immunology rebates. It's huge. Do you really want to kill that golden goose? No. I mean, so the PBMs will put them on the formulary, but they're not going to push them. And the PBMs have already exercised control over products like Taltz and Cosentyx and Otezla, and like they've been very public. I'm not saying anything that's not available in the public domain, of course. But yeah, I think at best a biosimilar may hit 30% of the market. And I know there's exceptions out there. Avastin, Herceptin, and Rituxan have much greater penetration rates. So there are examples that prove my comment wrong. But I think 30%, because I think if I'm right, I think AbbVie said 37% erosion is what they're expecting for Humira. But yeah, I'm not convinced they're going to be viable commercial products. Dave.
In the interest of time, I'm gonna withhold thoughts on it. It's not an area I'm, as well versed as you, Bill. So why don't we?
All right. So the last we got, we'll sort of move on. So we talked a lot about what we heard, from sessions and hallway discussions. Was there anything that you thought was missing or you really were expecting to hear that you didn't?
Dave?
Maybe it's, I would have expected to have heard a little bit more about, there was a lot of discussion about the IRA, but I wasn't really hearing a lot of, of conversation around sort of the regulatory regime. And, right now, even if you look at sort of just antitrust type issues, they're extremely one-sided. In the healthcare area, I was looking at, sort of a research piece that looked at the healthcare area and what were the number of FTC actions in kind of healthcare, and far and away the number of actions were highly weighted to pharma, like over the last 3 years. No conversation around, the fact that you have 3 buyers that control the worldwide generic marketplace. You have 7 vertically integrated healthcare companies that effectively control the health insurance marketplace in the US. There are hundreds of manufacturers, and yet, FTC's going after Amgen and Horizon, and maybe there's a good reason for that. I'm not going to comment on the legalities. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one. But it just seems like it's just so, unweighted. It's just so focused on the wrong side of the tracks, and that sort of the regulatory regime is just it's just bad policy. I think you're going to squash innovation, and I get it. There's a lot of valid concerns around pricing in the country and ways to address it. I just don't think that government intervention always is the right way. And if it's going to do it, it should be done fairly, and it should be addressing some of the other drivers of cost in the system. You know, pick your poison, 340B, et cetera, and all the unintended consequences of government actions and interventions that were the cause of prices getting priceless, getting ballooning out in the first place. So I guess I would have been looking for a little bit more of that. But again, I know it's just pharmacy conference and not a one on legalities. But in this climate, I think it might have been helpful to just have a session on that and hear different perspectives.
And that's what's going to make our conference in the fall that much better. Access Insights first week of November, full commercialization. We're going to rock these topics hard. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, for me, there were kind of three main things I'm still not hearing. And maybe it's because people don't see things from the top of the trees that we hang out in. But it's the archetypes and the benefit structures. I think there's still a lot of confusion as to how a pharmacy benefit product works versus a medical benefit. A lot of people that still don't know what assignment of benefits means. Like, they understand it's a white bag, but they don't understand what white bag means as an AOB. So there's a lot of confusion there, I think. But even so, this is kind of a dovetail to number two, is I think the cell and gene space and the orphan rare are really for the elite in the industry. I mean, they're very complex therapies, very hard to get access, medical benefits not being established for these in many cases, and you have to process a letter of agreement. And I mean, like in Tegra Chain, I mean, we actually do the processing of those LOAs for a few of our clients. And then I think the big one that's missing, and I don't really know how to solve for it, is the industry needs a really clean view of pharmacy economics. So the manufacturers struggle with having the topic, or like to having the topic discussed, because, oh, there's a perception potentially that we're selling on spread. We're not selling on spread. We're making sure that the channel in which we sell our product through is viable. Because when we got national chains out there with screenshots saying, do not accept prescriptions for this drug, we don't make money on it, who's that a problem for? That's a problem for manufacturers, and more importantly, it's a problem for the patients. Because I mean, kind of back to your earlier point, Dave, I mean, we're in this to bring science to market. And if we don't have a viable channel to bring that product to the patient, I mean, it should scare us that a pharmacy only makes 3 cents on the dollar on a brand product. That's innovation, where we make 43 cents on a generic product that is commoditizing and knocking down an industry that's already falling. I just think we got to have the economic conversation. We got to find a way to compliantly have it, but it's got to be central to the discussion. We can't hide from it.
All right, so thank you. We plowed through all of the key takeaways from Asembia. There is one question that came in, which I think is a great way to end, and I'll give you each 30 seconds, which is, so if we have this webinar next year, what are we going to talk about? What's the 1 or 2 things that we're going to be highlighting from Asembia 2024?
Dave, do you want to
go? I hope it's not the elevators again situation, because it is pretty funny, like just the elevators at the Wynn. But yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of these same topics are going to take a long time to play out. So that's the beauty of Asembia, is things change really fast, so it's sometimes hard to predict what the latest thing is. But I would expect that we're going to be really trying to unpack and deal with a lot of the issues that we're still talking about and grapple with them. So I don't think we're necessarily going to hear any completely new things, but I would expect there will be a whole new series of interesting maneuvers in terms of acquisitions or new innovations. I would expect some kind of more disruption, but I'm not a good prognosticator. I don't gamble a lot anymore. Ever since my bookie got thrown in jail, I don't gamble a lot.
All right, Bill, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, and I know we're at the top of the hour here. I'm just going to say it's trying to see the forest through the trees. 'Cause I feel like the complexity out there is so massive, and I can feel a changing of the guard between like the folks that are in their 50s and 60s that are starting to retire from the industry because the game is getting harder and harder. And they're like, yeah, this is a good time to get out. And that kind of leaves the 20 and 30-year-olds that are new to the industry in a position where, yeah, best of luck trying to figure this thing out, because what archetype, what therapeutic area, what benefit structure through what site of care. I mean, the array of all those topics are so hard. And like when you've done one, like the commercialization strategies are becoming like snowflakes, right? They're all just so very different. So I think it's the complexity, and I think we have a responsibility to help the new generation of our industry to try to learn as much as how it got here, so that they can help figure out, because we got a heck of a storm ahead of us for the balance of the decade.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Bill, Dave, I want to thank you for braving Vegas another year and sharing with everyone your insights. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Bill and Dave. And just want to wish everyone have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting, Michael. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.